They say the wind out here carries stories old ones, buried deep in the dust. I've ridden through 100 of them in my time, but none like hers. It was the third week of October, 1886, and the light had turned gold the way it does just before the world goes cold. I was waiting on a delivery out by the train station in Dry Creek when she stepped down onto the platform, boots, scuffed dress wrinkled from miles of rail, and a photograph clutched in her hand like it still meant something. She didn't cry. That's what I remember first. Not the weight of her trunk or the curve of her shoulders under that borrowed shawl, but the way she stood still like she was trying to let the land size her up before she gave it her name. Her name was Annalise Romero, and she'd come all the way from New Mexico territory to marry a man who wasn't there. Now out here, women don't arrive without a plan. Not unless they're running from something or towards something they believe in so damn hard they're willing to risk the silence that might meet them on the other side. I saw it in her face, that fight between pride and desperation. Folks milled around barely noticing. A boy chased his dog. A banker shouted about missing parcels. But there she stood forgotten before she even got to be remembered. I tipped my hat and offered her a drink of water. Didn't know then what the wind had carried in. Didn't know that woman standing alone in the dust was about to change the heart of this town, or mine. But the land knew. Hell, maybe the wind did too. That night the wind turned colder. Not the kind that stings just the skin, but the kind that slips in under your coat and settles in your bones. I didn't sleep much. Couldn't stop thinking about that woman with the quiet eyes and the too heavy trunk. Annalise Romero. She said it soft, like the name had been dropped too many times to trust it wouldn't break. The man she came for, Alfred Morton, wasn't just late. He'd sent word through some freight clerk that he'd changed his mind. Claimed she wasn't what he expected. Far as I could tell, he hadn't even shown up to see. Left her with $5 in an envelope and the kind of shame money don't fix. Dry Creek wasn't a place built for second chances. It was built on salt sweat in land deals signed with broken promises. Folks out here didn't have the luxury of softness. Not in words, not in action. And yet, when I rode past Miss Nettie's boarding house the next morning and saw Annalise out on the porch sweeping like she'd always belonged there, something shifted. She'd unpacked her trunk. Now that to me says more about a person than any sermon ever preached. Some folks keep their boots by the door ready to run. Others, they plant their feet in the dust and wait for the storm to come. Miss Nettie had taken her in for a few nights. Said the girl cleaned better than a deacon's wife during harvest supper. Didn't ask for charity, just a broom and somewhere to earn her keep. The town, of course, started whispering that she was trouble, that she was a liar, that maybe she was one of those women, because out here, if you're unmarried and unclaimed, you get looked at like something left behind on purpose. But I'd seen her eyes, seen how they scanned every board on the porch for loose nails, how her hands moved without rush like she was trying to fix something invisible. That kind of stillness only comes from someone who's had to learn the hard way that panic don't solve much. A few days later, I found her out behind the general store trying to patch the heel of her boot with a splintered spoon handle and a length of old twine. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice low, "I reckon I've got a better fix for that." She looked up wary but didn't flinch, just nodded once. Took her to Jeremiah Walker's ranch. Man's land butts up against mine out past the North Ridge. Widow quiet type, never says more than needed. Keeps to himself since his wife passed 5 years back. But he's good people. Fair. And he'd been looking for help with his livestock somewhere between the lambing and the busted fencing he'd fallen behind. When I introduced the two of them, Jeremiah just studied her for a long moment, then handed her a pair of work gloves and pointed to the tack room. Didn't ask where she came from. Didn't ask what she was running from. Just gave her a job. By the end of that week, the barn looked cleaner than I'd seen it in years. The roan geldings she'd brushed down had stopped kicking, and Jeremiah, for the first time in a long while, started setting out 2 coffee mugs in the morning instead of 1. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. Sometimes folks that been cracked by the same kind of loss can hear each other without saying much at all. I'd ride by and catch him in the garden, not speaking, just working side by side. She'd pull weeds while he nailed up fence rails. And somehow that silence between them, it hummed louder than most town squares on a Saturday night. One morning I brought her a box, said it was something I'd found in my attic. Inside was an old photograph frame, empty. She blinked, confused. "It's missing something." "No," I said, "it's waiting for something." She didn't answer right away, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch just a little. Not quite a smile, but close. Close enough to make me believe she wasn't planning to leave anymore. That day I knew something else too. Jeremiah wasn't just hiring help. He was remembering what it meant to come home to something. And Annalise Romero, was remembering what it meant to be looked at without being measured. Turns out sometimes the things we think we're running from are really just shadows of the life we haven't built yet. And sometimes what saves you, don't ride in on a white horse. Sometimes it shows up with hay on its shirt and a coffee mug in its hand. You can tell trouble by how it leans when it smiles. It was late November by then, and the cold had found its way beneath the doors. Nights came earlier, mornings stayed longer, and the ground out by Walker's ranch had started to freeze before noon. Annalise was still there, working quiet, steady. The kind of presence that slips into a space without stirring the dust and somehow makes everything feel more honest. I'd drop by now and then bringing feed or nails or just a thermos of chicory coffee, and I'd catch glimpses of the two of them never touching, rarely talking, but always side by side. But good things draw shadows, and in Dry Creek shadows tend to have names. This one wore boots with silver spurs and a hat too clean for a working man. Vernon Pike, owner of the Silver Bell Saloon. A man who never did a decent thing unless it bought him twice the favor back. He saw Annalise for the first time at the general store. She was buying flour and lamp oil. He tipped his hat, said something I couldn't quite hear, but the way she stiffened told me everything I needed to know. Later that week, he came by the ranch, claimed he was just checking on business, said he heard Jeremiah was employing a pretty little thing and wondered if she was open to other kinds of work, the kind that paid more and required less clothing. Jeremiah didn't answer, just stared at him with that dead still look he gets when something inside him starting to rise. Pike laughed it off and rode out, but he didn't forget. Men like Vernon Pike never forget when a woman says no. And he sure as hell never forgets when a man like Jeremiah Walker makes him look small in front of the boys. From that day on, I started hearing things. That the saloon hands were talking about Annalise claiming she was a liar, a fraud, even a runaway bride. That she'd made the whole story up to get sympathy. That maybe she'd fooled Jeremiah into giving her shelter. It was ugly, the kind of rumor you don't need to prove to make it stick. Dry Creek was never cruel outright. But silence can be just as sharp as any knife. I asked Annalise if she'd heard. She nodded once and said, "Words can't rot me unless I let them in." Then she went right back to splitting kindling, like the weight of it never touched her bones. But I knew it had. And so did Jeremiah. He started walking with her to town, never said why, just showed up with his coat and his rifle, and a look in his eye like anyone who tried something would regret it fast. One evening, I found the two of them on the porch after supper. She was mending a ripped shirt sleeve. He was oiling his saddle. Nothing romantic, nothing loud, but something about the way their silences fit together. It felt like church. I sat a while sipping coffee from a cracked mug, watching the last of the sun pull shadows long across the prairie. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked her. She looked up, brow furrowed. "Leaving where?" "Here, Dry Creek, this whole stretch of land." She shook her head slowly. "Used to think I'd have to, that I was just passing through, waiting to be sent away again. But now," she trailed off, eyes on the horizon. "Now I think I finally stopped running." Jeremiah didn't say a word, just glanced over at her with a softness I didn't know he still had left in him. And that's when I knew. It wasn't just protection anymore. Wasn't just kindness or shared labor. It was something solid, something that could stand. But men like Vernon Pike, they don't like watching something solid get built if they weren't the one laying the first brick. A week later, the threats started. A stray dog poisoned out by the barn. A fence cut letting the calves scatter into the brush. And a note nailed to the door in the middle of the night. "The girl don't belong. Send her packing, or we burn it all down." Jeremiah didn't show it, but I saw the tension in his jaw. Saw how he started sleeping lighter rifle within reach. Saw how Annalise started wearing her coat indoors, like the cold was creeping back in, even where the fire burned. And I knew something was coming, something worse than rumors, because wolves don't always howl before they bite. There are nights the wind doesn't just pass through, it listens. That evening, the air was too still, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs like a warning. Even the horses in my barn shifted restless hooves, clinking on dirt, like they knew something I didn't. I'd spent the day out mending a section of fence by Widow Lacey's creek, and the sun had dropped fast behind the ridge by the time I rode back in. From the bluff above Jeremiah's ranch, I could see the faint orange glow of lamplight inside the house. and 3 shadows moving where there should have only been 2. I didn't wait. Spurred my gelding down the ridge trail, rifle strapped tight. By the time I reached the barn, I heard the shouting. Not Jeremiah's voice, not Annalise's. Other men. I dismounted, silent boots sinking into the dry soil, and crept along the fence line. Inside the house, the front door was wide open. The lamp had been knocked to the floor, burning sideways against a scatter of flour and broken plates. And there she was, Annalise, back to the wall, holding a fire poker, like it was a blade. Jeremiah stood between her and 2 men, big, mean, the kind who laugh before a punch and don't care what they break. Vernon Pike leaned against the frame, smug as a snake in sun. "Wasn't gonna hurt nobody," he said, voice slick. "Just letting the girl know she overstayed her welcome." Jeremiah didn't move, didn't blink, just stood, shoulders squared, breathing slow through his nose like a bull learning patience. But the other 2, they moved fast. One grabbed at Annalise, the other lunged for Jeremiah. And that's when the world broke loose. I kicked the door in and fired a warning shot through the ceiling. Wood splintered, dust rained down, and suddenly everyone remembered they had a spine. "You boys lose your sense or just your manners?" I growled, keeping the rifle high. Vernon's eyes went narrow. "This ain't your fight, Callan." "Then why's it in my town?" I stepped in, fully closing the space between us. "Get out, now." The thugs hesitated, but Vernon didn't flinch. "You protect her," he said, glancing at Annalise like she was something spoiled. "You'll answer for what she brings." "She didn't bring nothing but decency," Jeremiah said, voice low and steady. "Which is more than I can say for you." Vernon gave him a long, dark look. Then he turned and spat on the floor. "We'll see who this town sides with when it burns." And just like that, he was gone. They left dust in their wake, and in the silence that followed, you could have heard a feather drop on a coyote's back. Annalise lowered the poker. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes weren't. "They'll come back," she said quietly. Jeremiah stepped toward her, reached out, but she flinched, then stopped herself, letting the space close. He laid a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. "We'll be ready next time," he said. That night, I stayed over. Slept on the porch with my rifle across my chest and one eye open. So did Jeremiah. And when morning came, we all looked different somehow. Not broken, just cracked enough to let the light in. We didn't report it to the sheriff. We didn't shout to the rooftops. We just boarded up the window, cleaned the mess, and made a plan. Jeremiah reinforced the doors. I rewired the back locks. Annalise boiled water, baked hard bread, stitched the cuts on Jeremiah's arm like she'd done it 100 times. No one said the word war, but it was hanging there like smoke before flame. By noon, word had spread through Dry Creek. Some folks turned their heads. Some crossed the street. But a few nodded. Quiet men, older women, folks who'd seen what fear does to good people and who weren't about to let it take another inch. By sundown, 2 neighbors dropped off a sack of flour and 3 rounds of 44s. By nightfall, there were lanterns in windows all down Main Street. And that was the thing Vernon Pike didn't understand. You can scare a person. You can shame a woman. But if you corner the right kind of people, you don't make them run. You make them rise. Some choices come like thunder, loud, sudden shattering. But the one Annalise made, it came quiet. Like snow melting off the roof in the first warmth of spring. Soft, slow, but certain. We were 4 days past the attack at Jeremiah's homestead. The windows had been mended, the doors reinforced with oak braces he'd carved himself. Still, the air around us held a tension, like the land itself was bracing for what might come next. I was sitting on the porch swing with a mug of black coffee when the letter came, delivered by stagehand, neat envelope, stiff paper, and the seal of Thomas Mitchell pressed red into the wax. She opened it in silence, stood near the stove with hands that didn't tremble, not anymore. Her eyes traced the words slow, line after line of regret, revision, and rewritten promises. He wanted her back, said he'd made a mistake, said the lawyer acted without his true knowledge, that she still had a place waiting in St. Louis, and that he would send a carriage and gold to escort her there with dignity. No apology for the insult, just restoration of the deal now that she was suddenly being talked about in town like something more than a mail order mistake. I watched her fold the letter once. Then again, she didn't tear it, didn't cry, just slipped it into the fire and let the flames do the speaking. Later that night, when the light had thinned and the world had turned quiet again, she asked me a question I didn't expect. "Sam," she said, voice calm as creek water, "when do you know it's real?" I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Same way you know when winter's done," I said. "Not all at once. But you wake one morning and the birds sound different." She nodded, then turned toward the window where Jeremiah was fixing the hinge on her garden gate. His sleeves rolled back, bent, moving without hurry or show. "He never promised me anything," she whispered. "He gave you something better," I said. "He stayed." You see, Annalise had spent her whole life waiting for permission to belong. From her father, from Thomas Mitchell, from the townspeople who measured women by silence and obedience. But Jeremiah, he never asked her to shrink, never tried to buy her story, rewrite it, or sell it back wrapped in ribbons. He simply made space and stood beside it. That next Sunday, under the cottonwood tree behind the chapel, she said yes. There was no orchestra, no lace, just the preacher, a crooked ring, and the way she looked at him like a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was. And the town came, all of it, even those who'd whispered their doubts behind hands the week before. They brought bread blankets, fresh-cut wildflowers. Miss Lacey played a fiddle tune. My niece sewed a blue ribbon onto Annalise's shawl. Jeremiah wore his best shirt, hadn't worn it since his brother's funeral. And when he took her hand, there wasn't a man or woman there who didn't feel the quiet power of it, that choice made in the face of fear. That love built not on fantasy but on survival grit and shared silence. After the vows, she stood beside me for a moment, eyes bright but dry. "Did I do right?" she asked, voice barely above the breeze. I smiled. "You didn't marry safety, Annalise. You married truth, and that's always right." As for Thomas Mitchell, he left Dry Creek 2 days later, horse hitched fast and mouth tight. Didn't say a word. And no one asked him to, because out here a man might have money, might even have manners. But if he can't stand beside you when things get hard, he don't belong beside you when they're good. That night, Jeremiah lit the hearth, and Annalise danced slow in the kitchen, humming something soft in Spanish. There was soup on the stove, the windows cracked for breeze, and for the first time in a long while, peace sat easy in the corners of that house. I didn't stay long, just long enough to hang my hat and leave a carved whistle on the windowsill for the child they'd surely have someday. And as I rode out under that indigo sky, stars prickling through the dusk like old songs remembered, I thought about how sometimes the thing you think you're chasing turns out to be the storm before the clearing. How rejection can break you, but if you're lucky, it breaks you open. So something real can grow. Stick around. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever chosen quiet truth over hollow comfort, leave a note in the wind below. And don't forget to follow the trail. We've got more stories riding in with the next breeze. It happened just after the harvest moon. The last of the apples had been picked. Smoke curled lazy from chimneys, and the air carried that quiet before winter, the kind that presses against your ribs like a memory. Most folks figured things had settled. The preacher had blessed Jeremiah and Annalise beneath the cottonwood. Laughter returned to the diner. Even Miss Whitaker stopped clutching her pearls when the couple walked by. But peace in Dry Creek was like a still pond above dynamite. And I reckon none of us saw the fuse until it burned right to the powder. It was a Thursday when the letter came. Stiff parchment, gold-sealed, bearing the emblem of T. Mitchell & Co., delivered not by post, but by a man too clean for this land. Trim beard, gloves that hadn't seen dust, voice like rusted sugar. He called himself Mr. Alcott, said he was Thomas Mitchell's lawyer, claimed the property Jeremiah lived on the same land passed down from his granddaddy was entangled in a deed transfer mistake, one that could now be resolved amicably for the right fee. Only thing was, the fee happened to be the entire homestead. And Annalise. Mitchell hadn't quit. He'd regrouped. And this time he was playing with documents and threats instead of roses and promises. When Jeremiah refused, Alcott didn't shout. He just smiled, said he'd return with enforcement. And sure enough, 3 nights later, a fire lit the north end of the barn. The animals got out. The tools did not. I arrived at dawn, found Jeremiah sitting in the dirt, shovel in hand, eyes rimmed with smoke and ash. Annalise stood behind him, arms crossed, tight face unreadable. She didn't cry, not her style. But I could tell something in her had snapped clean, not from fear, from clarity. She didn't wait for the law. Dry Creek had law, sure, but not the kind that worked when men with money pressed papers into palms behind closed doors. So she rode to Sheriff Raleigh herself, laid down the charred contract, spoke plain, and asked him a question no one else had dared. Are you the law of Dry Creek, or just the echo of Thomas Mitchell? The man blinked, took off his hat, and in the silence something shifted. Next morning the sheriff rode out with 5 men, not just deputies but townsfolk, the blacksmith, the schoolmaster, old Mrs. Delaney's nephew. None of them wore badges, but they all carried rope and resolve. They didn't bring violence. They brought truth. See, turns out the land grant Jeremiah held was valid after all. The town clerk had the papers hidden behind a cabinet Mitchell thought he owned. And when Alcott returned with his wagon and smirk, he found the people of Dry Creek waiting, not with guns, but with ink, testimony, witness, and fire in their eyes. He tried to protest, called them small backward, said he'd bury this town in litigation. But he'd already lost, because Annalise didn't run, because Jeremiah didn't flinch, and because truth quiet as it walks leaves deeper footprints than fear. When the dust settled, Alcott left. So did Mitchell. No fire, no final shot, just the slow collapse of a man who thought power could replace presence. A month later, the barn was rebuilt, beam by beam, raised by hands blistered and proud. No one asked for coin, not even the preacher. Said it was time the town repaid the kind of strength that didn't swing fists or write checks, but held steady when everything else buckled. That winter snow came early, but inside the homestead the fire burned warm. Annalise tended herbs by the windowsill. Jeremiah read aloud, voice low, shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. And me? I sat outside under a frostbit moon fingers, wrapped around a coffee cup, watching the steam rise like prayers. You don't always get to choose the storms that come, but you do choose who you stand beside when they hit. And out here in a land where the wind remembers everything, that's what makes you family. If this story brought something to mind a moment, you stood your ground, or someone stood it for you, drop it in the comments. Out here, every voice in the wind has a place, and if you're not already riding with us, go on and saddle up. Hit that subscribe. There's more truth blowing in. Spring came late that year. Snow melted slow off the ridge, and the wildflowers were shy to bloom. But when they did, the whole valley came alive like it had been holding its breath just for that moment. Jeremiah carved a bench from the last pine plank in the old barn, placed it under the cottonwood where he and Annalise first made their vows. No words etched in, just a spot for sitting, remembering, and letting the wind pass through your thoughts. I'd visit sometimes, leave a pouch of dried apples or a pair of gloves stitched new. We rarely spoke about the past. Didn't need to. It was in the way they looked at each other, in how she leaned her head on his shoulder when the day got quiet, in how he reached for her hand, not to hold her in place, but to make sure she knew he was still right there. They didn't chase the world. They just let life find its rhythm and chose to be still enough to hear it. One morning after the frost had gone and the birds had come back, Jeremiah found her out there on the bench. Eyes closed, hands folded like she'd been praying. But she wasn't gone. She was just resting. And when she opened her eyes, she smiled. That's what forever looks like out here. Not loud, not shiny, just steady, gentle, earned. And maybe that's the kind that lasts. Out here in the West, we measure time by the wind and trust by silence. This story, it ain't about grand gestures or loud victories. It's about choosing to stay, to love steady, to rebuild even when no one's looking. It's a reminder that some of the strongest things in this life don't shout, they simply endure. So if this story brought someone to mind, someone you've held on to through your own storm, or maybe someone you wish had stayed a little longer, tell us in the comments. You're not alone, not here. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, let the winds bring you back. Because around here, we believe stories, quiet, powerful ones still matter. And yours might just be the next one carried on the wind.